There may be enemies at the gates. There may be enemies within the walls. Sometimes the very landscape and climate in which a culture grows must be conquered. It may be too rocky, too arid. But here canyons and gullies became the streets and thoroughfares for one of the most spectacular civilizations in all of human history. This is Petra, where the sheer improbability of its location was also the secret of its spectacular flourishing. The reason why this tomb endured and survived armies and earthquakes is that the Nabateans who built it cut it into the sandstone surface of the mountain rather than build some freestanding marble monument. The mountains shook with earthquakes, but these buildings stood intact. The Nabateans were never a large people. Their kingdom was always relatively small. It never had more than 1 million subjects, maybe half that. But they did engineer a series of systems to trap the rains which came in winter. And their desert hydraulics made this place not so much rose-red as bright green, a garden city of fountains, swimming pools, groves, and orchards. And the water which made all that possible also made it possible to feed a city of 30,000 people, many of whom were immigrants from all over the region. There were Egyptians and Syrians and Judeans and Greeks and Romans. And they were all coming too. Petra to enjoy what the Persians called a paradisa, a pleasure resource, a little bit of heaven on earth. And they all brought a flourish of their own cultural styles with them. Most of the art discovered here has been taken to museums. What survives tells the story of a cosmopolitan playground. There are curious abstract representations of a Nabatean goddess, carved heads from the wine-soaked Hellenistic count of Dionysus. Recent excavations have brought to light ritzy villas carved into the living rock inside them. Here's to happiness murals from that same Dionysian cult, cherubs, vine leaves, the inevitable bunches of grapes, and from the later years of Petra's life, Byzantine mosaics found beneath the sand and rubble of a ruined church. You might think you know what Petra looked like, but nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is, we have no idea. Yet unlike the other great cities of the ancient world, Petra didn't preserve in the way that Athens or Babylon did. It was not an imperial capital, though it certainly played its part in imperial systems. And when Rome fell and the seas of civilization receded, Petra was not abandoned. People lived here under Muslim dynasties right up until the 19th century, so it's a much more recent discovery. Petra was literally lost to the world until Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered it in 1812, when he entered through the Sick, that narrow gorge which leads to the treasury. He described it as one of the most impressive pieces of architecture ever seen. He was referring to the treasury, one of the most spectacular monuments ever constructed. When you enter through the Sick and round the final bend and see it illuminated by the shaft of sunlight, it really is a breathtaking sight. But the treasury was only the tip of the iceberg. So far, only about 15% of the site has been excavated. And while the famous facades of the treasury, the monastery, and the royal tombs have captured the imagination of the world, they're only a tiny part of what was going on here. Underneath those iconic facades are countless houses, dozens of churches, temples, bathhouses, colonnaded streets, an amphitheater, a huge stadium, an elaborate water system. In other words, an entire city, a capital city, a place of around 30,000 inhabitants, possibly even more. It looks as if Petra was founded in the 4th century BC by the Nabatean king Aratus. The Nabateans were descended from the Arab tribes that herded their goats and camels across the barren hills. They grew into a trading people, became masters of the desert, learned to survive in its harsh conditions, and mastered the art of long-distance trade. And that led them into conflict with the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt and then the Seleucids from the east. The latter war went badly, forcing the Nabateans to flee southwards. By the middle of the 3rd century, they controlled all of northern Hejaz and southern Syria, but it wasn't enough. King Aratus IV wanted to push north into the Levant. To do that, he needed allies. So he married his daughter to the last king of the Ammonites, making him king of a new kingdom called Arabia Petraea, with Petra as its capital. That was the moment when the Nabateans really began to grow. And the reason they could expand so rapidly is that they offered everyone who came here a chance to live somewhere unique. Everyone felt welcome. The influx of foreigners turned Petra into a melting pot of cultures. People here followed many different religions, worshipped many gods, spoke many languages. There were synagogues, Christian churches, pagan temples. The language spoken in Petra was a mix of Arabic, Greek, and Latin. If you wanted to put up a notice announcing that your house was for rent or sale, you could do it in any of those three languages. There was a saying that the moon in Arabia shines on all religions equally. Nowhere else in the ancient world could you find such religious tolerance. And if you were a merchant looking for a place to stash your goods, nowhere else could you find such a secure place as Petra. The treasury is thought to be the facade of a building which once housed the royal treasury and perhaps the palace as well. We don't know for sure because it hasn't been fully excavated. But we do know that the facades which inspired Burckhardt to such breathless admiration were only the front onto a courtyard. Behind that was a complex series of rooms and chambers and passageways. If we look at the architecture, we can tell that there were people living here who knew how to work with marble. That's what the columns suggest, the lintels above doors, the cornices. But it doesn't quite match what we know of classical Greek or Roman architecture. It's a hybrid style, a combination of Greek forms and Nabatean engineering. And that hybrid style is evident throughout Petra. Here, for example, is a Corinthian capital, but it's made of sandstone. And instead of resting on the top of a column, it's embedded in a wall. And then there's this strange chair-like structure. What on earth is that? Nobody knows. It's one of the many unsolved mysteries of Petra. What we do know is that the Nabateans loved their gardens. Throughout the site, we find traces of those garden cities, the water channels that fed them, the storage jars that collected rainwater, the canals that distributed it, the elaborate system of dams and cisterns that held it. The whole city was a gigantic hydraulic machine. And if that hydraulic machine worked so well, it was because the Nabateans used the hard rock of the mountains to channel the water, because they took full advantage of the natural contours of the land. In the course of excavating the royal bathhouse, archaeologists discovered a gigantic pool filled with water. It had once been surrounded by colonnades, perhaps a place to exercise, to bathe, to socialize. But what makes it so extraordinary is that it was created by channeling the water along the contours of the mountainside. It wasn't just a pool, it was an integral part of the hydraulic machine. The water flowed through it on its way to the distribution center. As for the decorative elements of the architecture, well, it's harder to say anything definitive about because, once again, everything has been taken to a museum. What remains is largely utilitarian, but it does include a few beautiful examples of Nabatean sculpture. In the garden city of Ataroth, near the entrance to the city, stands a fallen angel. Or maybe it's a fallen titan. Or maybe it's Atlas. Whatever it is, it's broken into three pieces. Its wings are shattered, its knees are bent, and it's carved with a startling realism. We have a couple of other fragmentary statues, some fragments of an altar dedicated to Zeus, fountain decorated with griffins and a winged Nike, but none of those statues are reliefs. Give us much clue as to how the Nabateans conceived of the divine. Instead, we turn to the many altars and inscriptions that tell us about the cults that thrived here. There was a cult of Dionysus, the god of wine, and his worship seems to have flourished. Petra became known as a place of revelry. People came here from all over to take part in the festivities. Side by side with Dionysus, there was a local deity called Dushara, the name given to a number of local Arabian deities. She appears on coins, on altars, and she seems to have been especially popular. There was also a local male deity. We don't know his name, but we know that he was associated with rain and fertility. What we can say is that Petra was a place of many gods, a place where people came to worship whoever they chose, a truly free city. In the end, though, it was that freedom, that openness, that inclusiveness, that was probably its undoing. It was the cosmopolitanism that made Petra so attractive to so many people. 8. When the Romans seized control of the incense trade in the 1st century AD, the Nabateans lost their economic and strategic value. It's not that the Romans despised the Nabateans as such. It was just that they weren't interested in keeping a petty tribe alive. As the great trade routes shifted east, Petra's role diminished. People still came here to enjoy themselves, but fewer and fewer people. By the early centuries of the Christian era, the Nabatean kingdom was finished. The The great hydraulic machine was dismantled. The water stopped flowing, and the desert reclaimed the city. Over the centuries, earthquakes shook the mountains. The treasury was damaged, but it was still standing. Petra had its day, or rather its centuries, and then it ended. So it's just as well that the world forgot about it, because otherwise it might have been destroyed. But now it's back. Thanks for watching.